In this segment, I'd like to talk a little bit more about Chapter 7 and Chapter 13, the differences between the two of them, advantages and disadvantages, and also circumstances where bankruptcy may be more beneficial in a Chapter 13 despite all the other indications saying Chapter 7 or vice versa. The first and the most important consideration when you're looking at a Chapter 7 or Chapter 13 bankruptcy is to determine if you're eligible for a Chapter 7. One of the requirements of the bankruptcy code is for us to look at what they call the means test. What the means test does is essentially it looks at your income as a household or economic unit, if it's a little bit easier to think of it that way, and compare it to the median income here in Southwest Florida for the same size household. Now, just because you're above that median income isn't a complete bar against filing a Chapter 7 or a Chapter 13. But what it does mean is if you're above the median income, we have to look at standardized, what they call IRS expenses in some areas, your actual expenses. But ultimately what we're looking at is to determine whether you're eligible for a Chapter 7 or you're eligible for a Chapter 13. This is a determination that's made irregardless of other factors. There's just certain instances where the individual won't qualify for a Chapter 7, no matter what the other situations are. They may have zero assets and they may not have anything of any value, but they're still not going to be eligible for a Chapter 7 if they don't get past this threshold. So a lot of times, even though the other factors will point to a Chapter 7 or something, this is kind of that threshold issue. If you don't get past the means test, then the options are typically either Chapter 13 or Chapter 11, and Chapter 7 is not available. It's probably one of the greatest areas of confusion among the consumer. Is they'll say, my neighbor qualified, or my neighbor did a bankruptcy and I know he makes more money than I. Or he did a Chapter 7, why can't I do a Chapter 7? There are other factors, certainly. If the debt is primarily business debt, meaning that the debt was incurred primarily for a profit motive, then the means test does not apply and a Chapter 7 may still be appropriate. There may be reasons why you can't file a Chapter 13 because you're above the debt limits, and so you have to file a Chapter 11. So there are certain circumstances that make each case unique, but a general rule of thumb is that if you can't pass the means test, you can't file a Chapter 7. Let's say we have a hypothetical situation where the person has passed the means test and they're eligible for either a Chapter 7 or Chapter 13 bankruptcy. What's the next thing that we should look at? Well, the next thing that we look at is your assets. Here in the state of Florida, there are two different exemptions schemes or pathways, if you want to call them that. One is if you have your house and are claiming your homestead, and one is if you're not claiming a homestead. If you're not claiming a homestead in the state of Florida, you can protect $5,000 worth of personal property and $1,000 worth of equity in a vehicle. If you are claiming a homestead in the state of Florida, you can protect $1,000 worth of personal property and $1,000 worth of equity in a vehicle. So when we start looking at whether Chapter 7 or Chapter 13 is appropriate, the next thing to do is total up the dollar value of your assets or estimate the dollar value of your assets as accurately as possible. It's extremely important in this scenario to make sure that you list everything, to make sure that you talk about all of your assets, to talk about all of the property that you may own. Because in order to give an accurate representation of what you may have to pay back, then if we're missing a big item in there, if we're missing a ring or we're missing a piece of property that you hold somewhere else, it's hard to give you accurate information. One of the most common things I hear people say is, well, in a Chapter 7 I don't have to pay anything back, right? And that's not true. Whether it's a Chapter 7 or Chapter 13, you may still have to pay somebody something back. It's just a matter of How much? Well, in a Chapter 7, that how much is determined by your assets. If you have $9,000 worth of assets, including $2,000 worth of equity in a vehicle, and you can protect $6,000 worth of property, then you're going to have to either pay back or surrender property that totals at least $3,000 to your Chapter 7 trustee. So the Chapter 7 may still result in amounts being paid to the court, even though it is a Chapter 7. Now, that line of demarcation, if I have assets and I'm going to have to pay money back, is it better for me to pay them back in a Chapter 7 or Chapter 13? To some degree, this question always relates to, well, how much is that number? In a Chapter 7 bankruptcy, typically you have three options. One is to surrender property to the trustee that exceeds your exemption amount. One is to negotiate a buyback or a payment option with the trustee, typically over a period of 12 months, or to do a combination of the two items, where you're going to surrender some property to the trustee and you're going to pay back the rest. Well, if you want to keep all of your items and your overage from your exemptions totals $10,000, if we break that down, or let's say for easy purposes, you exceed your exemptions by $12,000, you basically have to look and say, well, I'm going to have to pay $1,000 a month to the trustee. And then if we look at your budget and you're only making $2,500 a month, and you have to pay your home and your car and all of those things, well, it's probably not very feasible to be in a Chapter 7. The Chapter 13 is going to allow you to pay back that same $12,000, but it'll allow you to do it over an extended period of time, either 36 months or 60 months, depending on where you qualify. That means that if it's a 60-month payment, that $12,000 is now $200 a month versus $1,000 a month. So a lot of times when we're looking at protecting assets, the difference between the Chapter 7 and the Chapter 13, the first question to ask is how much am I going to have to pay back, or what that difference is.